Hello, everybody. My name is Rodrigo Beilfuss, and I'm the Artistic Director of Shakespeare in the Ruins, and I'm here with Jessica B. Hill.
Hey, it's been a while.
Been a while for a new episode of our series of conversations about the canon and playwrights, novelists, artists of all disciplines and intersections that have somehow not been given proper treatment throughout history, and we're here to just talk about them and their work in specific. And Jess, you have two artists we want to cover today in our conversation, right? Who are they?
So first, we'll be looking at Angelina Weld Grimké. She was a poet and a playwright, and her play Rachel was the first play written by a Black woman to be performed with an entire Black cast, which is huge, and it's crazy that we don't actually know her very well. And then we'll be looking at Machado de Assis, which breaks a bit from the mold. I was trying to only feature women, but oh, is it worth it? This man was incredible. He was a prolific Black writer from Brazil, and I know him through you, so I'll be looking to you to give us a bit more backstory. I've devoured his short stories, and I know that you're reading his novel right now. So that's it. Those are the two. And what's kind of nuts is that there are beautiful parallels to draw between the two. And they were kind of writing in the same situation or dealing with similar issues in different ways. Like there's a lot to talk about how they approach the work and how they approach trying to accomplish the same thing in different ways. So
Right.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that, and we'll get back to that once we've covered both.
That's great.
Okay.
How should we start?
We start with Angelina Weld Grimké's play, Rachel.
You can read that online, you said. You can read the play online.
You can find the play online. Yeah. And in fact, there's been a little bit of a resurgence as we're trying to, reinvent the canon across the board, right? So there's been a resurgence of the play. It was put on in London in 2016 or 2014, I think. And there was a production in 2020 in the States, I think. I'm not quite sure where we can find that. But so it was out of history, and then suddenly we're finding it and trying to bring it back. It's been compared to Ibsen, which I find wild.
In what
and
sense?
I can see it.
In what sense? Like
the darkness of how dark humanity can be, and how much it can kind of expand your notion of what is possible or impossible, or
right.
it has a very dark quality to it. You could put it in the Scandinavian country and you'd be like, oh yeah.
Does it feel like it's like natural? Because people often say that Ibsen is the father of naturalism, whatever that means. But does it feel like, does Rachel, the play, feel realistic in that regard, in a way that we've come to know realism? The sense of, like, as you say, humanity and its open complexity, psychology wise.
I don't know if I'd say psychology wise, but it definitely has well, when we get to it, you'll see every single character seems to react to racism in a different way.
Oh wow.
So it's sort of giving you the broad spectrum of what can be. And it also, she made a point, because she knew she was writing for a white audience. She makes the point not to labor on the point, like just sort of present the characters and what they're going through, and leave it at that for you to have to deal with the issues of it and why and how. And okay, so I guess I'll just get my dates.
Notes. Look at that.
Good.
Yes.
Right. So she was born in 1880, died in 1958. Born in Boston, Massachusetts, died in New York. So she's from the north of the States, from a biracial family. And she was very lucky. Her family were able to give her a good upbringing. She went to school, she went to university, she went to Harvard University, was able to pay for that by teaching. So was a teacher as well. And then in early 1900s, she started to write articles, and a lot of them are published, and a lot of poems expressing her concern about racism and the plight of Black free people trying to make their place in the world. she compares a lot the South and the North, and that's part of Rachel as well. We'll get to that, but just the insidiousness of a society where they say everyone's free, but not quite. So a lot of her poems have, it's like a melancholy or a yearning, I think is the word I would use. Like there's like a deep sort of chasm of trying to reach out and make things even and better. And another interesting thing is when she was 16, as people have been digging into her life, you start realizing why this woman was sort of put to the sides of history. I want to read it because I find it fascinating. So at the age of 16, she wrote to a friend of hers, Mary Bullrit. I know you are too young now to become my wife, but I hope, darling, that in a few years you will come to me and be my love, my wife. How my brain whirls, how my pulse leaps with joy and madness, how I think of these two words, my wife. So now you're starting to get the picture of a woman who was living a life of suppression, both personal and creative, both through her sexuality and through the color of her skin. So I feel for her a lot. And I'm loving that her play and hopefully her poems too will start to have a little bit more notoriety, and that we can bring this woman's name back into our discussion. She was also right at the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. So she sort of is the catalyst that leads to that. And that's where I have a whole bunch of other people I'd love to talk about, but we'll stick to her for now because she's sort of at the inception of it. Rachel, the play that she wrote, was a reaction to the wildly racist film Birth of a Nation. So this thing comes out and she wrote this play as in a reactionary way. It's about a family called the Lovings, and everything seems peachy at first. They're in Philadelphia. The mother is a seamstress. She has two teenage children, Rachel and Tom. And Tom is doing stellar at school, and now he's looking for work as an engineer. And he got amazing grades, and now he's just trying to see, like, what does the future hold? So he's full of this brimming sort of potential. And Rachel is she's very romantic, and she already has these ideas in her head of wanting to be a mother herself. And there's a lot of children in the neighborhood, and she's sort of seen as like the adoptive mother to all of them. One of them hurts themselves, she brings them in to heal them. Like she has a very empathetic quality to her. And she has this beautiful speech at the beginning of, I can't wait till I'm able to have children myself and give back to the community. And so it all sort of seems rosy, and then there's this sort of dark secret that feels very, maybe there's something Ibsen to that already, or even Chekhov or something. Like there's something kind of, the gun is introduced, but then you don't. So, where's the father? We don't talk about the dad. Okay. Oh, and she mentions her brother, but it's not this brother because the brother's here. There's another brother. We don't talk about the brother. Okay, so there's this family secret of the father and the brother that kind of haunts the play as you go forward. There's also the introduction of another character. There's a woman that moves into the building with her son, this little boy who just refuses to talk. And Rachel takes him under her wing and empathizes with him and tries to get him out of his shell. And if I'm remembering correctly, the mother dies of smallpox about halfway through the play. So Rachel actually adopts this little boy. And as they're trying to get to the reason why he's not speaking, you realize it's because he's being bullied at school and called names, including the N-word. And it's kind of just destroying any kind of sense of who he is. And, so she, that hits her. And then she wants to try to shelter him from it, but starts realizing she can't because it's everywhere. It's pervasive. And that terrible darkness starts creeping into the family life. The brother can't find work. He's trying to find work anywhere that he can, but he keeps getting turned down, but it never seems to be for the right reasons. And you start realizing, okay, no, racism is sort of stopping him from being able to fulfill his life goals. Rachel has a suitor. There's a man that comes that wants to marry her. So this should be the path, right? Like she wants to be a mother, so she should get married. And they're both in love and everything would be fine. But he doesn't want to get married till he can find a respectable job, and he can't find a respectable job. She wants to wait, and you can sort of start to feel that she's sensing there's something deeper and more pervasive and more perverse to it all. And then the big crux of the play is that you find out that the mother moved the entire family north from the south because the father and the other brother were lynched. And then so that's the huge crux of the thing, where Rachel sort of ties the experience of seeing these young children in the neighborhood going to school, having to reckon with racism, especially like a silent kind of racism and a very vocal one, but nothing physical, theoretically, and reckoning with how violent it can actually be and how damaging and destructive and murderous. And she reckons with the fact that she can't shield them from it. And the end of the play is the decision to never have children so that they never have to go through that sort of loss of innocence and loss of hope.
Yeah,
it's terrible. It's just this journey into darkness
right.
and pain.
Wow. Yeah, that is, I can see the, I mean, also the way you're describing it, that there's a deep reality to it, right? A deep just, you know, just a revelation of the pain, of the reality of that is, I can see why somebody would say feels too real, feels too naturalistic, right? That it would compare to a type of genre that is incredibly about the deep psychology of being alive. Yeah.
I mean, it's also it feels modern in the sense that we're not necessarily 100% past that. Right?
Exactly. That's the thing. I kept the number 1880 kept coming to me. Her birth, the playwright's birth year, right? Angelica's birth year. So it's of how, yeah, that feels incredibly now. Yeah, my goodness. And is it so you think there's a revival of this? There has been interest in recent years to bring this play to light, right? You're saying. And do you think her voice as a playwright and a poet will find its way into the discourse of drama nowadays, or you think that there's still there's a resistance in the zeitgeist to such works, such as Rachel, for instance?
No, I think she's going to slowly make her presence felt. Yeah. I think what is fascinating and important to underline, that's what's going to give her place, is that it was a political move. You know, it was a political piece of work, specifically because it's never actually said that it's bad. It's just, that's how it's naturalistic. It's just sort of showing how these people are having to live with it. Her knowing that it's going to be a white audience. So it's just letting you a little slice of life of how it is damaging for children, for young adults trying to make their place in the world, for older adults trying to make it safe for their children, having to move, having to relocate, haunted by terrible things that have happened in the past. It's a window into the psyche of a Black American living in the north of the States, in a way that hadn't been done before, I don't think. So I think that's what makes her really important, and that's what makes that play. And then the fact that you can go, oh crap, this is so relevant still to today, right?
I also love that the spark was this reaction to Birth of a Nation, right? There's this like an artistic calling that she felt it was a spark to react, to respond is probably a better word, to this you know, thing that was not true or truthful. And then this work of art comes out of an artist, right, in response to a moment, in response to an event, in response to the state of things. And also you were talking about the destruction of these people, but also the destruction of the future, right? That this decision to just like, that's it, this suffering stops with us now, because I cannot bear to continue it, because I don't see, as you say, hope, right? And that once you destroy hope, once you destroy this ability to envision a future in which you can breathe, that is the ultimate, cruelty, that you destroy somebody's ability to see that future. So that's heartbreaking. Yeah, deeply heartbreaking.
Completely. And there's a very strong axis on children, right? From throughout the entire piece, having the little boy present. Rachel's constantly talking about the children, right? And how there's something so present and so uniting in a child's way of seeing the world, and in a child's excitement of making its place in reality, and watching at what point the child breaks through having to navigate through a world that is so damaging. The accumulation of it is what does it for her. And I think that's the final piece that she has, is about children and what kind of world are we building for them. There's this terrible thing about roses too, and I think she destroys a bouquet. I remember her destroying a bouquet of roses and saying sometimes it's more that's where she's come to her logic, is it a charity that we're doing to destroy rather than to let them go through more hardship, in terms of these are flowers that were cut already and they will die, so why not speed up the process or something? It's terrible. But yeah, so that's cheery.
No, but that's what an amazing work of art. One of the reasons why we're having these conversations is to bring these artists to light, but also just to talk about artistic process, right? What is it that sparks that act of creation in one, right? And I'm just now haunted by this idea of, as a response to Birth of a Nation, this comes out of her, and it's when you're an artist, right? It's just you respond to the world around you with your art and the way you can create. And but her act of creating poetry, as you mentioned, right? She's a poet as well. And her act of creating a play out of this, however the message be about a destruction of a future, the act that she created a play is an act of hope, right? Is an act of right?
I'd like to see
there's
it
a future,
like that.
and now that we're in 2022, are talking about her, somebody who was born in 1880 and forgotten through time, or put aside through time, and now in 2022 we're talking about her. And on some level, she must have known that, because then otherwise you just can't even create, right?
The act of creation in itself is an act of hope. I like that saying, because it feels like a cry, right? It's a cry. We are here. We are suffering. Let us make our place in the world. Yeah, definitely. And just the fact that she is coming back, and that it is so resonant, and it is so potent that it deserves its place.
Exactly.
I think the message comes across.
Yeah. And you mentioned her poetry as well, and you have a couple of her poems that you can share with us.
I have two poems that I would love to share with you.
Please.
This is awesome. So one is about race, one is about love. And I'm just going to jump right in. The Black Finger. I have just seen a most beautiful thing, slim and still, against a gold sky, a straight black cypress, sensitive, exquisite, a black finger pointing upwards. Why, beautiful still finger, are you black? And why are you pointing upwards?
Wow. Again, we mentioned hope, right? We mentioned hope.
There it is. There it is. Okay, and then this one's called El Beso. Twilight, and you quiet the stars. snare of the shine of your teeth, your provocative laughter, the gloom of your hair, lure of you, eye and lip, yearning, yearning, languor, surrender, your mouth and madness, madness, tremulous, breathless, flaming, the space of a sigh. Then awakening, remembrance, pain, regret, your sobbing, and again, quiet, the stars, twilight, and you.
My goodness. El
There you
beso,
go,
you said?
yearning, yearning,
Yeah,
yearning.
yearning,
Yeah,
right? And the
here it
reaching,
is.
I'm feeling the reach, right? The finger pointing out and this. So it's called El beso, you said, the kiss?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In Spanish. Any particular reason? Can you guess why it's in Spanish?
Her father was a diplomat to Dominican Republic.
Oh,
And
phenomenal.
she didn't stay there that long, but she was definitely going back and forth. So,
wow.
Yes, I'll try to see if I can find anything.
That's gorgeous.
That, isn't that lovely?
Yeah, and also feels incredibly contemporary. Feels incredibly fragmented in the way that, you know, the whole.
It's about evocative. It's shorter, like it's sparse. It's right down,
And it's just like, you know, communicate so directly, so simply, unadorned, not Baroque in any way, not literary in that sense, just beautiful imagery, and fragmented, kind of feels like a dream or images being, you know, when you see, you're seeing images in your mind, and you're just kind of going through that. You know, your mind is just flipping through images, and you're just seeing this and this, and then this comes. Yeah, it's very powerful, very powerful. That's great, Jess. Shall we jump in? Like as you were talking about her, and tossing dates out there, and tossing the you know, just the events of history around at the time, it was amazing to think of the parallels with Machado de Assis, right? And how there's so much there to bring those two together, to bond, to kind of bring them into this, in the context of Black voices at that time in the late 19th century into the 20th century, and how just that world feels so removed from our reality now, and yet so present. You know, it feels like, you know, because Machado is Brazilian like myself. When I think about Machado de Assis, I think about the Brazilian Empire, and I think about the 19th century, and how just vastly different that world is. I can't even imagine that reality, and yet every day that reality is just present in Brazil, still in its very complex racial tensions and you know, 21st century realities. So it's just a mind-boggling exercise when we look at, you know, when we talk about the canon, it means that we're going back in time and talking about the names that have made into this, you know, special team of artists that we have somehow decided to immortalize. And there's so many voices that we don't pay attention to. But then this exercise of going back in time to design what we call a canon is so strange, because it is all about accessing a time that is gone, and yet seeing how that is still so present in our realities, and hence the idea of canonizing these names, right? I'm not sure if I'm making any sense.
You're making complete sense, and it's still present, and we're connecting the dots. It feels weird only because we're going back in time and realizing, oh, wait, that's so similar to now. But history has been written by the people who won history, and you have all these voices that were denied a place, but once they're back in and everything connects, you realize that they've just been the exact same part of the story since its inception, right? It's just that if you don't have the middle, then you don't have the connection. If you have the beginning,
Right.
middle, and end, you realize, oh, there were Black people in Elizabethan England. There's a whole Black population in Brazil, right? Connecting the dots. That's all this really
Absolutely.
is.
Yeah, and it really is a way of trying to understand how we got here, right? How we got here. This idea of finding a common understanding as to why things are so twisted in reality, and how these artists through time have tried to raise these flags of like, hey, things are messed up. Things are messed up, and here's my work that expresses that. But in honor of talking about Machado, today I wore my Rio Flamengo jersey, which is the most popular soccer club in Rio, where Machado de Assis was from, and it's the club of the working class, and it's the most successful soccer club in Brazil. So I decided to wear the Flamengo shirt because. Shall we chat about Machado then? Shall we talk about
Machado de Assis? Yeah, sure.
I see. I call him his first name because in Brazil we always refer to folks by their first names. So I call him Machado, but folks here call him de Assis or Assis. But his full name is Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis. It's a long name, but let's talk about Machado de Assis then. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Do you wanna lead us?
Since my God. It's your webinar. No, I'll lead us. Sure. Well, so here's the thing, though. He's just such a. This is again, right? It's interesting because he's such a titanic figure in Latin America and more specifically Brazilian culture. And in high school, while folks here were reading Shakespeare, I was reading Machado in Brazil. Instead of reading Othello, which is the ultimate tale that Shakespeare wrote about jealousy and the ramifications of evil through jealousy, I was reading this novel called Dom Casmurro, which roughly translates to Sir Curmudgeon or Don Curmudgeon, which is the story of an insanely jealous man. And again, what happens to one's faculties when jealousy, as we see in the Winter's Tale through Leontes, when jealousy just eats away at your soul and your mind. So he is this titanic figure, but in the Anglo-centric world, still fairly obscure. This man, Machado de Assis, and I've often, and there are many reasons for that. I find that we can discuss here. But I think one of the big ones is language, of course. He wrote in Portuguese, so he lives through translations. And I think Machado kind of came into, he's still big amongst academic circles, and professors and literary figures all know who he is, and there are books written about him, and many translations of his novels and short stories. And he also wrote some plays, but that's not what he's known for mainly. Loved the theater, but the thing that kind of launched him into popular discourse about 10 years ago, Woody Allen, who's maybe not the best endorsement nowadays, but Woody Allen kind of mentioned in a magazine that one of his favorite 10 books of all time was a book called The Epitaph of a Small Winner, which is this book right here, which has been retranslated in 2020 and relaunched under the title The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas, which is closer to the original title, which literally is Memórias Póstumas de Brás Cubas, so Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas. And Woody Allen said in a magazine that it was one of his favorite books of all time, and that kind of got Machado's name in the popular zeitgeist of pop novels. And then more translations of his work started to pop up. This one being from 2020, which is fairly new. And then he kind of became a little more well-known and more talked about in the artistic circles, not just academic circles. But so I found that to be delightful that people were talking about him, because he was gigantic in my childhood. But the thing that was not big in my childhood was his actual biography, who he was and what he was, which now is something we talk about. And in the context of Black History Month, one of the reasons why we're talking about him right now. This is a man whom Harold Bloom, the gigantic literary figure Harold Bloom, called the greatest Black writer in Western literature. Like, that is just an astonishing statement from somebody like Harold Bloom, right? Or Philip Roth called him the great ironist, a tragic comedian. So the greatest Black writer in Western literature. And then, you know, it dawned on me, Machado is a Black man. And nobody was telling me that when I was a kid in Brazil, because the photo that we got, you know, in all of his books, and this is pre-internet, of course, and you have in your book there, right? A portrait
yes, I do.
his. And even that portrait is a bit, right? It's not, doesn't give the full picture. So that was the portrait that was in his books when I was growing up and reading. But it was not, it was mostly a drawn, like, you know,
a sketch?
Sketch of that portrait. So with no color, nothing added, just an outlined, you know, silhouette sketch. So you just couldn't tell that there was the image of a Black man. But he was a Black man. And we didn't talk about that growing up in Brazil. So, you know, like, it's fascinating because so many of us Brazilians are awful. So many of us are mixed race in Latin America, right? And my grandfather was a Black man. So you have this, you know, this tension of people not talking about the reality of the complexity of race in Brazil, in Latin America. And then Harold Bloom needs to tell us that he's the greatest Black writer in Western literature. Then we go, oh yeah, that's awesome.
And even us going, oh yeah, it's awesome. And yet, if you're saying Western literature, how come we don't know? How come there's a huge swath of English population that has never heard of him before?
That's the thing, right?
Fascinating. Yeah.
That's the thing. So then, you know, he's, and I think if we go over his biography, right, he was born in 1839. He was born during the Brazilian Empire and lived his whole life in Rio. That's why I'm wearing the Rio Club shirt. And died in Rio as well. And like Shakespeare, you know, this is a man who stayed in this one place, but was able to absolutely transcend that place to write stories that took place in many, you know, realms of imagination and different environments. He died in 1908. He had no children. His wife died before him. She was a Portuguese woman called Carolina Augusta. Like every great creator, you know, he was an expression of his time, but he also was the exception to his time. And if we study his life and work, you really get a picture of 19th century Latin America, specifically Brazil, of course, and how he was different. And the prejudices that he suffered kind of tell a story as to why he was forgotten through time beyond Brazil, or not given the proper treatment. There was a racial prejudice. He was a Black man. And for 49 of his 69 years of existence, he lived in a country that was, you know, still a slave-holding country. Brazil was the last country in the West to abolish slavery. And he also suffered social prejudice as somebody who had epilepsy. And he was a very poor background and had great literary ambitions. And he also suffered intellectual prejudice because he was a writer determined to have a language that was concise and clear and popular. Whereas at the time, you know, you have this idea of language having to be Baroque and poetic and, you know, formal in some way. And he was kind of rejecting that. And then, you know, because he became very popular amongst literary terms as a short story writer, and he wrote countless of them. And you have a collection there that
right here,
right?
Yeah.
And that's why some of the Anglo academics call him the Black Chekhov, because his tales are all about, and you can guide us through the tales that you read about by him. They're all about this longing and this yearning and the city life and the country life and just people, real people with passions and yearnings. And he was so prolific as a short story writer that hence the, if Angelica got the Ibsen comparison, he got the Chekhovin comparison, right? And we're still framing these great minds of their own in the context of these great white men, right? Isn't that messed up that Angelica is like,
yep.
The Black American Ibsen and then this Brazilian Black man is the great Chekhovian? It's just messed up. But and somehow, because of the way everything is, we need these structures to help us understand where they fit, like they fit in a box, right? Yeah. And then I think, the thing that he is praised for a lot in today's Brazil as well is because he was the founder and the first chair of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. And there has been only 23 chairs of this academy, and he was the founder of it. And this is a man who had very poor education, and he taught himself French, English, German, and Greek in his life. And I have here framed on my wall his translation of Shakespeare's To Be speech. And I have it on my wall there because it is such a beautiful translation. It's so poetic and so in verse. I'm looking at it right now. It's in verse and it's so complex and beautiful. And he translated Shakespeare's Hamlet amongst other works. I mean, I don't understand how somebody can live the life that he lived as a Black man in a society that operated economically, socially under slavery, and he served as the Minister of Agriculture. He also worked for the Trade and Public Ministry, and he worked in newspapers, and still finding his way to becoming a writer through these posts, these official governmental posts, and how he can learn these languages and have access to these things. I just don't understand how a mind can be so brilliant that it can overcome all those barriers.
Telling as well as I had read somewhere that when he died, none of that was mentioned. None of his literary success, it just said civil servant on his gravestone. So that's a little bit telling right there of how people are going to write your story for you.
Isn't that bonkers? He dies, and then at the time they go, civil servant, dead. Yeah. And then Harold Bloom calls him the greatest Black writer. It's like the dissonance is just astonishing, right? But that's funny that you mentioned that because, this book that I'm diving into right now, Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas, this is the autobiography of a man who has died and then wrote his autobiography. It's a very cheeky book written from the grave. So it's written in the first person. It's very experimental. It was published in 1880. And it's not a memoir that was published posthumously about a person who lived and died. It's a memoir of somebody who is dead and writing his own memoir from the grave. The whole thing is in short chapters in the first person. His name is Brás Cubas, this character that Machado invents. And the book is dedicated to the first worm, the first nod at his bones. And because it is written by a man who is dead, he has no fucks to give. So it's finally the release of this man, Brás Cubas, who lived a very mediocre life and had an affair with a married woman, a great passion of his, but then didn't really ascend in his life, in his job, lived an ordinary life like most of us go through, nothing spectacular about it. But then he dies, and then he writes his memoirs, and he doesn't hold back. There's gossip about people in his life. He has no sense of guilt because he's dead. How wonderful that is if we could all write from that freedom. So Machado invents this character, very ironic, very just, sharp, that has no F's to give and just tells the story of his life from a place of absolute honesty. And there's no sentimentality. There's tons of humor in it. I can see why Woody Allen would have liked this, given his, cynical, formerly good comedies from the past, like Love and Death or Crimes and Misdemeanors. And it's just so experimental. Like some chapters, for instance, he plays with form. Like for this one here, it's called The Age-Old Dialogue of Adam and Eve. And there's no words, but just punctuation. So it's Brás Cubas, Virgilia, his lover, talking about.
Could you bring it closer? Because I can see it here.
Yeah.
It's like ... question mark ...
Question mark.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. There's no words, and some of them are, they're short chapters. But I thought about sharing a couple of them, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
This one here is just to give a sense of the tone. This one, and sometimes he'll be narrating the story of his life and talking about events and stuff, and then he will stop the action and talk about a dream he had, or he would just stop the action and address the reader. And in this case, he addresses a critic. So he's telling the story, and this chapter is called To a Critic, and is, my dear critic, some pages ago, upon saying that I was 50 years old, I added, you already have noticed that my style is no longer so nimble as it is in first days. You may find this incomprehensible given my present state. He's dead. But I would call your attention to the subtlety of my remark. I do not mean that I am older now than when I began the book. Death does not age one. What I do mean is that at every stage of the narration of my life, I experience the corresponding sensations and feelings. So help me God, I have to explain everything to you. He just kind of addresses the critic, kind of anticipating a possible criticism, right?
Right.
And then you turn the page and it says a new chapter of how I did not become a minister of state. And it's just periods.
He's just so playful. He's so playful and witty and experimental. And it comes across in all of the stories as well. But it must have stood out so much from what else was being written at the time. And breaking all kinds of barriers as to what is possible in literary form.
He was like postmodernist, whatever that means, before postmodernism was a thing. He was experimental. Yeah. This is 1880 when this was published. Like, it's so full of twists and turns and ironies. Like, as Philip Roth says, the great ironist, right? He's a tragic comedian. So this book is just so rich in experimentation. And I had before we jump into the short stories, I thought I was going to share another little bit from this book, from the other translation.
Of course.
That's okay. This is from the chapter called The Delirium. So he stops the action to talk about a dream he had, a feverish dream. The character, Brás Cubas. So this is a dead man writing about a dream he had. So he says, so far as I know, no one has yet related his own delirium. I shall do it, and science will be grateful to me. If the reader has no taste for the contemplation of psychological phenomena, he may skip the chapter. Let him go straight to the story part of the book. And then he says, this is part of the dream he has. I know only that an immense shape, the figure of a woman, then appeared before me, with its eyes shining like the sun, fixed upon me. Everything about this figure had the vastness of the primeval. It was indeed all too much for human perception, for its contours were lost in the surroundings, and what appeared at first to be dense turned out, in many cases, to be diaphanous. Stupefied, I said nothing. I didn't cry out. But after a short time, I asked who she was and what she was called. Curiosity, born of delirium. They call me Nature or Pandora. I am your mother and your enemy. You, Nature? The Nature that I know is mother only and not enemy. She doesn't make of life a scourge, nor does she wear such a face, indifferent as the tomb. And why Pandora? Because I carry in my bag all good things and all evils, and the most remarkable of all, hope, man's consolation. Are you trembling? Yes, the way you look at me. I know, for I am not only life, I am also death, and you are soon to give me back what I loaned you. Come, my great leecher, the voluptuousness of extinction awaits you. Then I looked at her with suppliant eyes and begged a few more years. A few more years would seem like a minute, she exclaimed. Why do you want to live longer? To continue to devour and be devoured? Are you not sated with the show and the struggle? You have experienced again and again the least vile and least painful of my gifts. The brightness of the morning, the gentle melancholy of dusk, the quietness of night, the face of the earth, and last of all, sleep, my greatest gift to man. Poor idiot, what more do you wish? Isn't that beautiful? Pandora.
That is awesome.
I know.
Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah. I just love this idea of a man writing from a place of not giving fucks, because however we talk about artistic freedom and process, we're all very worried about what others think of us, right? So to create a character that writes from the grave is so freeing, right?
Yeah.
Right. What did you discover in his short stories?
Oh, wow. That's incredible. Well, to preface that, first off, you weren't sure what you were going to say, and then you went on I knew you were,
I'm
because
sorry.
I know that, what are you sorry about? It's beautiful because
Okay.
you've lived with him for so much longer and you loved him for so much longer. Like, this is the thing that upsets me, is that I wish that I would have met this writer a long time ago. I wish that this was taught in schools in English,
Right.
in translation. And it appalled me when I would hear you talk about the greatest Black writer of the Western canon, that I had never read it or even really knew what it was going to be about. And I kept thinking I wasn't going to understand, or that it would be something culturally that would feel like a translation.
Right.
And then to come across these stories, these short stories, and I devoured this book. And you compared him to Shakespeare, you compared him to Chekhov. And to me, those two things are so true. Like, you can see how much he loved people. Right. He loves humanity in a way that I find both Shakespeare and Chekhov do. He loves the idiosyncrasies, the passions, the obsessions, and tries to bring a mirror up to human nature, with all of the warts, right? And that's where the irony comes in. That's where the cynicism comes in. But it's always tinged with wit and a little bit of playfulness of, like, you're like that, right? There's always a sort of showing you how we all mean well, and we really don't behave as good as we could, and we should, just a little nudge to to bring the best parts of humankind back to itself. It's so good. It's so good and so playful and so imaginative. And there's so many I want to talk about. I don't even know. I guess we should start a little bit on him. His parents were freed slaves, right? Because you're talking about how the abolishing of slavery happened about 40 years in his lifetime.
It happened in 1888 was when it was
so 50.
Abolished.
Right. But there was a sort of phasing out that they didn't have in the States, right? There was a law that came into effect in the 1870s called the law of the womb, or the free womb, the law of the free womb, where from then on, any child, regardless of race, was going to be free. But it was phased in. So you're in this weird, he was living through this really strange time where there were so many different stratas to look into. There were slaves, there were servants, there were waiting people, there were people that had regular trades there, right? And having to navigate through that, and like you said, having the wit and the want of knowledge to transcend that, self-taught from very, very meager means, epileptic, teaching himself other languages, really reaching towards, you can feel Ovid, you can feel ancient Greek writing, you can feel Shakespeare, his love of theater. It's all in his work. And then he meets a woman who's very cultured and very well learned. They fall in love immediately, and she brings him into more of the English sphere. I think that's probably where he got more into Shakespeare.
Right.
I've read a few of his plays, and they don't have the same wit that his short stories are. And I think once you had referred to him as a disgruntled playwright, like maybe that's what he would have frustrated.
Yeah, I think in many ways Chekhov himself was. If he Chekhov, well, we have 4 or 5 plays of Chekhov, right?
He hates them all. He used to hate them so much. Or how Stanislavski was putting them on. Yeah, you're right.
But short stories, prolific and rich, right? I think Machado is a similar thing. I mean, his novels, there's 3 great novels. I mean, these are masterpieces, right? Dom Casmurro, Brás Cubas, and Quincas Borbas, and they're all part of at least they were when I was a kid, part of the curriculum in school, and they're all about social, analysis and psychology of the human condition and all these things with great wit, great irony, which is very hard for somebody in grade 9, 10, 10, 9, 11, 12 to really get. So for me, it was, reading Dom Casmurro in high school was tough. And I remember I had to write an essay about Dom Casmurro, and I was like, I'm not able to grasp it. I could sense that there was like this depth, but it was like asking a kid in grade 11 to write about,
to read Shakespeare. Yeah,
right. It's difficult. It's very difficult how we introduce these great literary figures to kids. But once you as you know, like you devour that book, right? Once you come to really know the pleasures of these authors, and you can see. But as you're saying, sorry, I totally interrupted you. But as you were saying, he's so theatrical in his novels and short stories, and in his life, in the way he had these different jobs, and how he moved through society. That I think he is a great, which is why we're talking about him here, right? Us being theater people, he's a great theatrical, right? That kind of found his form through short stories. But had he lived now or longer, maybe he would have found the theater in a way that, because the theater in Latin American society, at least in Brazil, didn't have the same power of expression or support that he did in England or in the States, right? It was or even in Portugal, the colonizers of Brazil, theater was not the great art form for that culture. It was the novel, or it was painting or poetry. But theater has always been a powerful cultural manifestation in England, for instance, right? But not in Portuguese culture. So maybe that's where his frustration comes from as well. Right. I don't know. But what else?
Oh my God. It's amazing. Yeah, I'm just thinking about how he teases his writers or his readers, right? Like there's something kind of leading you one way, and then or the critic, like commenting on the critic before.
I have to explain everything to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna give a quick survol, a quick look at some of my favorite overview. So he has a short story called The Devil's Church. Have you read this one?
No, I have not.
Okay, so the devil gets pissed off that everyone's going to church, but he can see them all sinning, and it pisses him off because he's like, well, clearly human nature is flawed, or like you're all terrible people, and you should be on my team. And this is bullshit, like saying that you're going to do something and then do the opposite. So he goes up to God and he's like, your creations are worthless. Wait a second, I'm going to start my own church, and I'll show you what your people really are. And so he starts the Church of Sin, and it's all of the 7 deadly sins are actually now virtues. So it's like, yes, what did you do? You did nothing today. You were slothy. Yeah, oh, you betrayed everybody. Yeah, like really kind of pushing people to be their worst possible selves. And at first it takes off, and everyone just feels so like, yes, fantastic. I'm free. I'm feeling like I can just embrace being terrible. And little by little, he catches them sinning by doing good things for each other. And it starts pissing him off. He's like, well, why did you give money to that person that was begging? Oh, I don't know. Or why did you started a soup kitchen? How dare you? It should be the opposite. You should be stealing. I don't know. So he's catching them in the complete opposite. And in the end, you start realizing like maybe it's somewhere in the middle. But I thought that was a perfect, it kind of encapsulates everything that he's trying to get at in these short stories, that we always sort of fall right down the middle. And you keep having to try to push to your best intentions, but humankind's deliciously flawed.
Yeah, and that's funny you mentioned that, because you also I mean, that also speaks to hope, right? That even if you start a religion, a church that is dedicated to sinning, people will find a way to be good. It's like, I'm really gonna punish them for that. Like, I find it's incredibly hopeful, and the way when you're describing it, kind of goes back to the bit I read here, that he writes in dialogue sometimes, right? That in a novel, in a short story, he will actually write the dialogue, which again speaks to his theatricality and his theatrical inclination. So you have these long bits of dialogues in his novels and short stories that read like a play, right?
Right. Yeah. It's so theatrical and so sort of, that's probably where he wanted to go. Yeah,
exactly. And because he writes in the first person often, or in the voice of the character, the whole thing is a monologue. Right. The whole thing, because Dom Casmurro as well, it starts with like the character explaining the title, and then it goes, the character explains the book, and the character addresses the reader, talking about the book. So it's you have this meta theatricality, right?
It's awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, what else? Okay. I kind of want to talk about the Academies of Siam, which I thought was so fascinating, because I don't think I've read anything else from 1870, 1880 that would have addressed this. But so he takes you to Thailand. He says, okay, imagine Siam, readers. I know Siam didn't have any academies, but let's just suppose it did for a second. And then you jump into it. And the whole premise, and then the story sort of kicks off, but the whole premise is the Emperor of Siam and his favorite concubine have this whole talk about whether souls have gender. And the Emperor of Siam feels like a female trapped in a male body, and the concubine feels like a male trapped in a female body. And he sort of addresses it, and then he poses it to his entire kingdom. Do souls have genders, or are genders taught, or like this whole thing, examining something that we're in the crux of right now. It's incredible. So, and then they find a specific religious group or a sect that knows how to switch souls' bodies. And you have to go out on a long boat out on the river at night. And then there's a sort of ritual that they do, and their souls float up and exchange bodies. And then suddenly they live a life that is so much more expansive and concrete. Whereas before, he really makes a point of saying, like, it's sort of counterintuitive to the role that they were supposed to fill in society. Then suddenly the king is, wanting to wage war and much more of a leader, and like it's very archetype. But it gets to a point where they had promised they would only do it for a year or 6 months or something. And then when the time comes, the concubine that's now the king is sort of going, I don't want to go back to that. It's terrible. So he plots to murder his lover. And the king that is now concubine finds out that she's pregnant, and then suddenly realizes that she's having all these feelings of feeling like she'll be both the father and mother to this child, because she has more of a breadth of experience of what it is to be wholly human in both genders and complete. And when she announces her pregnancy, he abandons all kinds of any kind of wanting to murder, and embraces the same thing, like, oh my God, I'm going to be both father and mother as well, and I can't wait to bring up this child in a way that is more whole. And that's not even the main story. That's just sort of like the umbrella of what's going on. And then underneath, it's just much more the ironicness that people say terrible things about each other behind their backs. That is basically what the story is about. And then you have this overarching, like, huge, expansive canopy of theme. Yeah.
That is remarkable. Again, right? Lived and died in Rio, like Shakespeare lived and died in the UK, in England, but talking about Thailand, right? Or this inventing this magical world, right? And then that's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. It feels now, and and then and going back to artistic process, you go, is that the mark of a great artist, that it always feels now? Like I'm so fascinated by that, right?
Right.
That you have this ability to kind of just reach across time and touch us in a way that we find the themes that we're so, like the gender theme, right? We're so deep in conversations about that. And then you have this black writer from the 19th century in Brazil who is imagining worlds and talking about it.
Yeah. Well, it just seems, I think you're onto something that does make the greatest art, right? Like the more micro it gets to, the most personal and the most barely able to put words to, the more connected we all are. Like a realization that there's so much more that makes us same than different. And
yes,
that truth
absolutely.
is not just of now, right? Like that truth goes through time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. He likes to make fun of people's obsessions and people's vanity and people's there's one, I wasn't going to talk about this one, but there's one that I had recently just read called The Chapter on Hats. And it could be now. Like, it's just a wife who's always been so docile and always has everything in its place. And she you know, she's a housewife and perfectly happy to be so. Her father one day makes an offhanded remark, "Your husband always wears the same hat. What the hell's that?" And he goes home. And then it just becomes like in her head. And her husband comes home and she just suddenly finds herself lashing out about, "Why do you always wear the same hat? What the heck's wrong with you? There's other hats and it makes you look bad." And he reacts to it. And so he starts attacking her back and they have this whole fight, leaves really, really upset. And she's so hurt and so humiliated that she spends the whole day breeding revenge. Like, maybe I'll have an affair, or maybe I'll just be out all the time, or maybe, like, based on this hat, and finding all kinds of different reasons why it's his fault and not hers. And throughout the day, it wanes and wanes. And then she starts realizing, like, I don't like being outside. I don't like people. I'm feeling kind of out of my element. Gets back home and feels this relaxation of being away from a sea of hats, the way he describes it. Like, it's all, he doesn't talk about people, he just talks about all the hats that have been around her at all times, like all these different hats interacting with her or being around her. And then she's finally home away from hats, notices that a flower pot is the only thing that's out of place because a maid put it in the wrong place. Like, everything has to be the way it is. And her husband comes home and she realizes that it's all her fault. And he's wearing a different hat because he went to go buy another hat to please her. And she takes it away and she gives him a hug and just like, "No, keep the hat that you had." Wow. It's the only one that's ended like positively. And I thought that was, it's such a little window.
A little thing, right? But then
psychology.
He can,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm not very familiar with his short stories. As you are much more familiar with his short stories. Did you find a common theme? You just mentioned that it's one of the few ones you read that ends in a happy note.
Yes. Yes.
What are the common themes that kind of tie the short stories? Is there a common theme or style or tone that he kind of lands on, or are they like so vast and different in style and scope?
They're vast and different in style, for sure. And I can talk about a few more that are completely off the wall, but it's always about human foibles, human, the obsession. There's always something wrong, or the piece of grit in the oyster that we just and obsess about until it becomes a pearl. You can tell that really, really obsessed him and made him want to feel like, what is that crux? There's one that's about a man who builds up his entire personality as being the soldier. Like, when he's in his family, they all talk about, oh, he's the general, and so always having to get the higher rank. And something happens where he ends up being at home and not being the soldier in context. His family has to go different places, and he's alone and at a loss, and has a reckoning in the mirror where he doesn't know who he is, doesn't recognize himself, starts having this whole psychological downfall of, well, maybe I don't actually exist. Maybe I don't mean anything. Maybe existence is a mirage. And the only way that he's able to reconcile it is by putting back on his military suit and standing in front of the mirror. And then he goes, oh, okay, that's who I am. So the sort of idea that like you are your job, or you are your merit, or your, and how this has skewed this person so much that he's not even able to recognize who he is or have any kind of other connection to the world.
But what an amazing insight into, you know, like the exterior, and you can bring race into it, you can bring class into it, right? All these things, and it's all there in the sense of like the way we see ourselves and others see us. Did you God, it's both funny and heartbreaking, right? That
all of them are that,
yeah.
And it always ends ambiguously. It's never, I think this is actually one of the reasons why people hesitate, because of how he was writing and when he was writing, and in the cultural context where there's all these different stratas where people are just coming to terms with, oh, slavery is about, but they're still slaves, but what do we do? And he doesn't make a comment on it. He's sort of presenting it in a way that Shakespeare did, in a way, right? He's a product of the society that he was in, and uses his characters and what they're going through to have the message go across. So it never feels slavery is wrong. It never says that. And I think that can really piss off people. But then when you really read who he was, where he was coming from, and what he's trying to say with the message, you realize that that is the message. It's just that it was conveyed in a different way. There's a story I want to talk about later, but I'll talk about it now.
Please,
What's it called? Father Against Mother. Oh my God. Okay, so it's a man who his job, he does this without any kind of sentimentality. Like you said, he always just presents the facts. Usually there's a little bit of irony or cynicism to it, but it just is what it is. So he presents this man who is a slave catcher. That's what his job is. But it's freelance, because you never know when that's going to happen. So he presents it as like, oh, this is a hustle that he has to do. He has to hope. Yeah. So he's not making a lot of money, because apparently slaves don't like to run away and get beaten up or whatever the heck, right? So it's hard for him to make a living, and it's hard for him, really tries to put himself in this man's life situation. Like, it's hard for him to prove that he's going to have money down the line, and he can't convince the mother of the woman he wants to marry that he's a suitable candidate, because she wants him to get a real job. They elope. He gets her pregnant. And now the three of them, slave catcher, wife, and mother-in-law that is pissed that it's all happening, lose the house that they're living in, because he's not finding work. And he tries other jobs, but he's not meant for that kind of work. And the mother-in-law makes an ultimatum. She says, there's no way that you will be able, we barely can feed ourselves. There's no way that you'll be able to feed a child. And what kind of world are you going to be bringing them into? Like, you won't know when you'll be able to have money. You're going to put us all destitute in the streets. When she gives birth, you have to put this child up for adoption. There is no other solution. And he's devastated, and he can't sleep, and he has these terrible dreams, and he just can't bring himself to do it. And she keeps saying, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. And really holds him to account. And then it comes to the fateful day where she gives birth, and the mother-in-law is about to do it, and he's just at a complete loss, and finally says, no, I can do it. Let me do this. So you have this image of this person is doing a terrible job that hasn't done it in a while, carrying new life and having all these new tender feelings about the child, and realizing that he's going to have to part with it. So now suddenly you're feeling empathy for him, but hate yourself for feeling it. And then as he's walking to the place where he's going to give up the child, he sees a slave woman escaping, and he recognizes her from posters from months ago that he had sort of tried and then given up. He sees this woman, realizes it's her, I think gives the baby to a local store owner or something, runs after her, captures her. There's a whole description of what they use to capture slaves and he never comments on it. It's just so cold and it's brutal. It's hard to read, actually. It was the hardest one for me to read. The manacles, something for like a muzzle in case the slave screams. Like it's so brutal in the description of it. Never really comments on how he feels about it. But he captures her, brings her back to the owner. And as he's bringing her, she just starts to plead to him, like, I'm pregnant. I'm going to give birth. I'm so scared that the owner is going to beat me, might kill the child. I don't know what to do. Please, please, please help me. And he won't listen. He says, that's not my problem. This is my job. Brings her to the owner. And as he's leaving, he watches the owner beat her until she gives birth to a stillborn child. And the last thing that he says as he's going home and picks up his child, still well and okay, and everything's going to be fine, and he's going home to his family. The last thing he says is, some people are allowed to live and some people aren't, or some people are allowed to hope and other people aren't. And so you're left with this. It's so brutal to read. And to see that he hasn't learned anything from his journey. But I don't think that that's what the audience is supposed to get from it, right? Like, I think he leaves you, all of them, in every single story, that one the worst, he leaves you with this gut and like this hole in your stomach and this sort of uneasy, does it have to be that way?
Right.
All of it. Yeah.
Wow. That
brutal.
Is. Yeah. He does this thing, right? It's just so sneaky, right? That he will open something up with humor and talking to us, the reader, and disarming us that way and being funny. And then he would just come and just knock us out with something so just so visceral like that, right? That is. Yeah.
Sorry, I found the line because I was misquoting it completely. The line is, not all children make it, his heart told him.
Wow. And you tie that to Rachel, the play, right? Where the decision not to bear any future. I mean, it's there, right? That these two artists were addressing this issue of the death of future for certain people. The death of future for certain people in the way we've set up the world, that they were in communication across time and across continents and across languages, and addressing through their art the very same, right?
Yeah.
Tragic fact. That's remarkable and heartbreaking.
Yeah, and equally powerful in both ways, right?
Unbelievable.
Conveying the same message in different ways.
With no sentimentality, with no not even like a way, not even like just such a sense of like painful resignation as to why we're so fucking horrible.
Yeah. Right.
But and yet underneath that, maybe a shred of like, does it have to be this way?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe later in the future we don't do this anymore.
Because that's the thing, right? Is that we do it to each other, I think, is what he keeps circling around. We are horrible to each other. We do terrible things to each other when we dehumanize each other. And pushing for empathy in any way that he can, in any direction that he can, sort of, it brings us back to our sameness rather than our differences.
I reckon that from that story, the message is that since he was able to do that job and get money for it, then his child gets to live with him.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody else's child, because of we know why.
Well, because of him, exactly.
Him, yeah.
He didn't have to do that. It's yeah.
Yeah. It's remarkable. It's again, yeah, what a painful fact of reality that these two artists existed in and wrote about the things that were around them in such a way that yeah, and yet how remarkable that they existed. They were able to create, they were able to tell us, right, in 2022 that this is the world.
Yeah.
Oh man.
No, it's we're at an exciting time with revisionist history where we are digging back, like I was saying, that connection the dots, like digging back, you find the root and then you keep going to see and you say, oh no, actually the root is here. Oh no, actually the root goes further and further and further back until you realize that this is work that has been a long time coming, and it's just that it's never been able to build on top of each other. It's these singular stories of people really trying to break out of the mold, reach out, make their presence known, make their mark, and represent their people. Yeah, it's I'm kind of excited, not kind of, I'm very excited with where it's going to go as the next generation sort of pieces all of that together. Yeah. And we have a fuller portrait of where we came from and how we can make it even better. Yeah.
That's a beautiful note to end this conversation, Jess.
Ooh, okay.
Beautiful. Yeah. This was a gift. Thanks for sharing. And for all those listeners and viewers, their work is widely available in the English language everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
If you just do the wonderful thing of Googling them, you will find them, and you'll find their work. Machado is wildly translated right now, and yeah, this is beautiful. I'm just moved by this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
All right.
Thank you
so much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.